Thank you very much, Vance, and thanks everyone for having me along here. Now, in Britain, we have a long-standing tradition of making hedges out of trees. And the people who do it are very skilled. They use a machete, and they take the standing tree, generally small trunks, and they slice it, often in one go, so that all that is left of the trunk is about that much wood. A little tiny sliver of wood with a little sliver of bark. Then they twist it, they bend it down, trample it, and weave it into the hedge. It's an extraordinary skill to watch, and at the end of it, they have this beautifully laid hedge with all these perfect diagonal sticks all lying in the same direction, and that creates a basis for the next 10 or 20 years of a very strong livestock fence to prevent the animals getting in and out. But you look at what they're doing, and you cannot help be struck by the extraordinary resilience of the trees which they have just almost chopped down. They've almost completely severed. How is it that these trees are able to survive the loss at that point where they cut of about 90% of their diameter? You just have this little half moon, this little crescent moon of wood left, and the whole of the rest of it's been chopped out, and yet the next spring, whoosh, they come shooting up just as vigorous as ever before. They must have been under some incredibly powerful selective pressure to have acquired that remarkable ability. We also see that most of the deciduous trees in Europe can coppice or pollard. In other words, they can sprout from whatever point the trunk is broken or cut, and they'll send up great shoots of suckers, lots of them coming up, which then form multiple trunks where there was just one trunk before. We can also see that you can strip much of the bark from a living standing tree and it will still survive. Again, these are remarkable adaptations. But perhaps most interesting is this, and something which struck me very forcibly only when I started thinking about it in light of what is to come. And that is that the understory trees of the European wood, species, for instance, like holly and box, which live under the forest canopy, and they have dark leaves, they're evergreen, and so they can survive underneath the closed canopy of the European wildwood. Even though they are far lighter, they carry much less weight than the big canopy trees like oak and beech and lime and ash, even though they carry less weight and they're subject to far lower shear forces from the wind, they're much harder to break. It's really difficult to break their branches, to break their roots. If anyone has done as I have, has tried to actually dig up a holly tree and remove it, and I've dug up, I'm afraid to say, like many environmentalists have plenty of trees in my lifetime, you hit the roots of the holly tree with the axe and it just bounces straight off. It's incredibly hard, which is why it's used for very fine, delicate carving. Why should this be? What an extraordinary thing. You have trees which are smaller, lighter, they carry less weight, they're subject to fewer shear forces from the wind, and yet they're a heck of a lot tougher than the huge, great forest canopy trees. Now, I believe that there is a single explanation for all these phenomena. Elephants. Does that sound surprising? It sounds surprising because we've forgotten that ours is an elephant-adapted ecosystem. During the last interglacial period, the straight-tusked elephant, Elephas antiquus, covered the whole of Europe. And it was a temperate forest species, living in a climate very similar to our own. It was a massive beast, closely related to the Asian elephant, but a lot bigger. A really fearsome, magnificent animal. Now, when the ice turned up about 115,000 years ago, the beginning of the Ice Age, they were driven out of northern Europe, but they persisted in southern Europe for much of the last Ice Age. In fact, some of the most recent finds, the youngest finds of straight-tusked elephant anywhere in the world are here in Iberia. In fact, the only set of elephant tracks discovered in Europe was found on the Portuguese coast. And one of the most recent finds of all, the youngest, just about the youngest find in the whole of Europe, was not very far from here on the banks of the Rio Tagus, an elephant dated at 33,000 years ago. So in other words, they lasted almost all the way through the Ice Age, and something bumped them off before the Ice Age ended. And they were living in climates a lot colder than ours are today. Well, it's pretty clear why they died out. Humans were hunting elephants right from the beginning. I mean, before we were really humans, when we were hominids. There are finds of elephant kills going back into the Hoxnean interglacial. 420,000 years ago, one of these kills is dated at. And remarkably, these hominids were killing them with sharpened sticks. And the animals they were selecting were the large dominant males in their prime. It's an extraordinary thing. Now, whether they were selecting them as a result of optimal hunting or just out of Paleolithic machismo, we don't know. But those were the animals that they sought out and killed with sharpened sticks. And what seems to have happened is that as hunting technologies became more sophisticated, and we see around the world, well, certainly in Africa and Europe about that time, we see much more sophisticated stone tools turning up around 40,000 years ago or so, then the hunting became more deadly and more effective. And we see hunting sites right across Europe. There's one, in fact, just outside Madrid on the Rio Manzanares, where that was from about 80,000 years ago, where a single elephant is surrounded by 750 stone tools. So there were a lot of people all gathering round and butchering that elephant and eating the meat. But by about 30,000 years ago, they have disappeared completely from the fossil record, and it seems that by that time, they were extinct. But their legacy is not. And you can see that legacy in every woodland, in every park, in every leafy avenue. The elephants are still with us. The shadows of these great beasts fall across our own shadows even as we walk along the streets, because they are there imprinted on the trees that have co-evolved with them. Just as Ian McCallum was telling us about the enormous impact, the tremendously beneficial and fascinating and complex interaction that the elephants have with their ecosystems in Africa, so the elephants in Europe must have had equally complex and fascinating interactions with our ecosystems. And you can still see the impacts of some of those interactions in these remarkable adaptations that the trees have. Why can you lay a hedge? Why can you coppice or pollard a tree? Why can you strip most of the bark off a tree and it still survives? Because trees had to do that to survive elephant attack. Why are the understory trees so much tougher than the canopy trees? Because they're small enough to be toppled if their roots aren't super tough, and their branches are much lower, closer to the ground, low enough to be pulled off if the branches aren't super tough. These, to me, are very clear signs of elephant adaptation. And yet, here's the thing. You read almost any paper on elephants and trees in Africa, and there are hundreds have been published, and it will tell you that a very large variety of trees, mapane, knobthorn, acacia, loads and loads of others, have evolved to resist elephant attack. In fact, they even use the word hedging. The trees hedge as an elephant adaptation. And they talk about coppicing, and they talk about pollarding, and they talk about bark stripping, and they talk about the strength of the branches and the strength of the roots. And everyone involved with elephants and trees in Africa knows this is what elephants do, so this is what trees do in order to survive the elephants. And yet a 3-day search that I conducted in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which is a copyright library, it's got everything, all the scientific papers, all the journals going back to the year dot, revealed a single throwaway line in one paper mentioning that just possibly there might be some evolutionary adaptation to a great beast such as possibly elephants. That was it. It has been completely forgotten. The contact between paleoecology and ecology seems to have been severed entirely. The elephant in the forest is the elephant in the room, that vast and obvious fact which everybody has somehow managed to overlook. And it's not just elephants. We have a shrub in northern Europe called the blackthorn or the wild plum. Some of you might have drunk sloe gin, which is made of the little sloes, these very bitter little wild plums which grow on this tree. And this will respond to attacks by producing extremely long spines, often 5 centimeters long or more, 2 inches or more. These spines are surely over-engineered to resist attacks by deer, but not perhaps to resist browsing by rhinoceros. Yes, we had 2 species of temperate rhinoceros in Europe in the last interglacial as well, the Merck's rhino and the narrow-nosed rhino. And just like the elephants, they were driven out of northern Europe by the ice, and just like the elephants, they survived in southern Europe until about 30,000 years ago. We are familiar with the work by Dan Jansen and others in the Americas showing that trees like the cassia and the Osage orange, the Kentucky coffee tree, the honey locust, these must have evolved in cooperation or alongside the great beasts of those continents, the gomphotheres, the giant ground sloths, the mammoths, the mastodons, and all the rest of it. And they show very powerful signs of this, and now everybody in the Americas who's involved in these issues says, yes, look, here's the Osage orange, it can't possibly be eaten by anything that's alive today, it must have been eaten by one of these great beasts, etc. But we are not seeing it here. Our plants show exactly the same level of adaptation to elephants and rhinos as the plants of the Americas show to the mammoths and the gomphotheres and the mastodons and the ground sloths. And yet it's not there in our minds, it's not visible to us. And it wasn't just rhinos, and it wasn't just elephants, hippos too. Hippopotamus amphibius, the same species that lives in Africa today, again persisted in southern Europe till about 30,000 years ago, having been driven out of northern Europe by the ice. And if you go, there's a wildlife park in England called Longleat. If you go there, the hippos live outside all year long. They're very happy there. They graze on the lawns, and they don't need to be taken in the winter because these are a more or less universal species. They can live in a very wide range of climates, not under the glaciers, obviously, but just about everywhere else. Hyenas and lions, well, they persisted far longer. They lived right through the Ice Age, even in northern Europe. There were lions hunting reindeer over the frozen tundra of Britain right till the end of the Ice Age. They persisted beyond the end of the Ice Age. They lived in northern Europe till about 11,000 years ago, in southern Europe till much more recently. But again, all of these species were wiped out not by climate, but by people. There are lions today living in the Novosibirsk Zoo in Siberia in outdoor enclosures. They've been there for 50 years in temperatures which drop to -50. They're perfectly happy. These are not exclusively tropical creatures. We associate the megafauna with the tropics simply because the tropics have the last refugia of these species which have been wiped out everywhere else. But everywhere had a megafauna. A megafauna is not an unusual condition of the ecosystem, it is a universal condition of the ecosystem. But we don't see it because we have forgotten. And there's a name for this forgetting, shifting baseline syndrome, coined by the great fisheries biologist Daniel Pauly, who explains that we conceive the normal state of the ecosystem as a state that prevailed in our own youth. And what we try to do is to restore the ecosystem back to that state. But we forget the fact that that state is itself highly depleted, and that the people of that generation look back to their youth as being the ideal state, and so it went on until we see this gradual erosion of our perceptions of what the ecosystem is alongside the erosion of the ecosystem. And it's through that forgetting, through that non-communication between the paleoecologists and the ecologists, that we lose sight of the fact of this universal megafauna. And hey, it wasn't just on land either. In 1776, the novelist Oliver Goldsmith, who was also an encyclopedist, a very remarkable man in fact, described the herring migrations off the coast of Britain. And this is something you could see from the shore. He said the main body of the herring was divided into shoals, each 5 or 6 miles long. These were the sub-shoals within the herring. They're all 5 or 6 miles long and about 3 or 4 miles wide. And they were so densely packed that the sea was black with them, and they pushed a bow wave ahead of them, which you could see from miles away. And these shoals were harried by dolphins, and by sharks, by tuna, and within sight of the shore, by fin whales and sperm whales. That you can see from the British shore, shoals or schools of fin whales and sperm whales hammering the herring. A few centuries before that, we had grey whales routinely in our estuaries and around our sandy shores. In the 1920s, the world record bluefin tuna was one caught in the North Sea off Yorkshire, just off the coast of Yorkshire in England. We had massive runs of bluefin tuna until the herring were wiped out in the mid-century. We had sturgeon, going back a little further now, sturgeon in enormous runs coming up our rivers, probably about 18 foot long, 6 meters long, the largest sturgeon which were coming up our rivers at the time, a bit like the ones that the early colonists encountered in North America. We had occasional landings of walrus on our northern islands, in the Orkneys and the Shetlands, and the walrus is another species which was far more widely distributed than it is today. We had sharks. We had not only the sharks which are still in small numbers coming to British waters, the blue sharks, the threshers, the occasional mako. There were great whites in British waters, great white sharks, which followed the other fish, which followed the herring migrations. This was a marine megafauna, which again was universal, again was not confined to the tropics. It was everywhere, just as the terrestrial megafauna was everywhere. And our forgetting conceives the current extraordinarily depleted state of the oceans as being just a little bit worse than it ought to be. Whereas in fact, it's a wholly different ecosystem, just as the ecosystem on land is in effect a wholly different ecosystem. We live in a shadowland, in a dim and flattened relic of what there once was, of what there could be again. And I see rewilding as both the means by which we can start to restore nature on a massive scale, and Europe has to lead the way in this. This is, possibly the most depleted region on Earth, but one where we have to start to set an example of how restoration can take place. I mean, we've got the money increasingly now, we have the land, we have the opportunities to do that. But I also see it as a means of reconnecting us with the natural world and with its extraordinary wonders. And what paleoecology tells us, paleoecology is like a portal through which you may pass into a magical kingdom. And what it tells us is that the wonders which we heard described this morning by President Chissano and others, the extraordinary beasts of Africa which people will travel for thousands of miles to see, these too could be ours. These too could be part of our European experience. And in fact, it seems to me that they ought to be part of our European experience. Now, one estimate suggests that even without a major change in agricultural subsidies, by 2030, an area the size of Poland, 30 million hectares, will be vacated by farmers. I don't use the word abandoned, which many people use, because that suggests that the land needs us. It's one of those words like improvement and stewardship and guardianship, which suggests that nature requires human intervention to survive. As a friend of mine says, how did nature cope before we came along? Because when you see, when you listen, unfortunately, to many British conservation groups, a lot of whom are in the Dark Ages, listening to, our colleagues from poorer nations today, they are way, way advanced. They are hundreds of years ahead of where the British are. We still have this sort of sense that we have this sort of biblical duty of dominion, that we've got to look after everything. And you really wonder, nature must have been in a pretty rough state for the 3 billion years before we came along to look after it. And And the sense you get also is that, well, all that big stuff is for other people to deal with. You know, and we heard these fantastic presentations from Li Quan, from the president, from the many other wonderful people who are on the panel, talking about how they, in poorer countries, far less resourced than us, are looking after these extraordinary animals, and we sit there nodding sagely and says, jolly good, yes, carry on, you chaps, that's exactly what you ought to be doing, while making very few moves to do the same ourselves. Now, I say that we're talking about an area the size of Poland, becoming vacated by farmers potentially by 2030, and that's without a change in the subsidy regime. And at the moment, the only thing which is maintaining farming in the uplands in Europe at all is farm subsidies, is taxpayers' money. And you know, at a time of great economic crisis, here in Europe, we continue to spend £50 billion a year, so 50 billion euros a year, in keeping people on those hills. And governments are desperate to keep them on the hills and to keep them doing the same thing as they've always been doing. In fact, the European subsidy regime says that you cannot claim your subsidies unless the land is kept in what it calls good agricultural and environmental condition, which is an Orwellian term if ever you've come across one. Because among the rules for good agricultural and environmental condition is that farmers must remove what they call unwanted vegetation, which the rest of us call wildlife habitat. So you only get your money if you clear the land. That land has to be kept cleared. You don't even have to keep anything there. You don't even have to keep your sheep on it or anything. You just have to mow it every so often, and then you can claim your money. But if you don't mow it, and the trees and the shrubs and the other unwanted vegetation come back, then you don't qualify for your subsidies. During the last round of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was concluded in June, the European Union raised the subsidy for farming in mountain areas from 250 euros to 400 euros per hectare on top of the other subsidies that you already get for being on that land. In fact, the less suitable the land is for farming, the more you are paid to farm there. So desperate are they to keep people maintaining these highly unproductive uses. I mean, we're talking, you know, 1 sheep per hectare or less in many of these places. It's enough to destroy the vegetation, not enough to make a living for anybody. In order to maintain these highly unproductive uses, they're paying an absolute fortune, taken from all taxpayers, however rich or poor, across the European Union, for what should really be described as a flooding subsidy. Because if you are closely grazing the watersheds of Europe with animals, or keeping them mown, or doing whatever it takes in order to maintain your subsidy, then what you are doing is ensuring that the rain doesn't percolate through, and you get a cycle of flood and drought instead of a steady stream of water from the hills. Now, I'm not saying we should get rid of all farming from the hills or anything, but I am saying that we should be asking some very serious questions about how our money is being used. And I think that the outcome of asking some of those serious questions is that we should start paying farmers not to remove unwanted vegetation, but to restore wildlife habitat in these places. We should stop paying for social bads and start paying for social goods. We should start paying for the mass recreation of habitat, so that we go right across the places where farming has become inviable because of global competition in the food market, and because the young people simply do not want to stay on the land. They don't want to follow their parents into farming, however much you pay them. This is why we're seeing this mass land vacation already across so much of Europe. I think we should accelerate that process by acknowledging that this farming is not viable and pay people to do something else. And one of those things, I believe, is to bring back the megafauna. Now, the lions, the hyenas, the hippos, admittedly there's not much of a clamour for their reintroduction in Europe yet, but we're working on that. They all still exist. We've got those species, they're still in Africa. And these are, as I say, universal species. They're like the wolf. They can live in a vast range of habitats. Elephants are a little trickier because, of course, the straight-tusked elephant was wiped out about 30,000 years ago, but not its close relative, the Asian elephant. And it strikes me as a remarkable thing that huge amounts of time and money and effort are now being poured into this, I think, quixotic project to try to resurrect the woolly mammoth, which you know, it's very hard to see actually what we're going to get out of that. Its habitat is declining very rapidly, and it does seem that there's powerful evidence that the woolly mammoth wasn't just wiped out by people. We certainly contributed, but actually climate change at the end of the Ice Age did have an impact. But there's going to be less and less habitat for woolly mammoths. It's a project which is highly uncertain of success. You know, will it really happen? Will there be enough woolly mammoths brought back from separate genetic lines to actually produce a viable breeding population and the rest of it? The only benefit I can see is bragging rights for the billionaires who fund it. I mean, after all, it is the best chat-up line which has ever been lost to humanity. Come and see my woolly mammoth. They've actually come to think of it. That could be horribly misinterpreted. So you know, we're putting all this massive effort into trying to restore woolly mammoths, and here we've got the Asian elephant missing most of it. You know, in most of its range, it's missing now. It's been confined to a tiny portion of where it once lived, and of where potentially it could live. You know, why aren't we talking about mass restoration of Asian elephants to its former range, and possibly to parts of Europe where its close relative, the straight-tusked elephant, lived? Rhino's a little trickier still, but there's an ecological correlate of the mercs and the narrow-nosed rhinoceros in the form of the black rhinoceros, which, like them, was a browsing animal and, like them, can live in a wide range of habitats. So there's a possibility there. I'm not saying any of this is easy or any of it will happen soon, but it is something that we should be thinking about and talking about, not least because applauding, as we absolutely should, President Chissano and Ian and Lee Kwan and all the other people that we've been hearing this morning, while not doing anything similar ourselves, makes hypocrites of all of us. Now, we've seen and we've heard over the last 3 days these wonderful stories of how a lot of wildlife is coming back in Europe. The wolves and the lynx and the bison and the moose and the red deer and several other species. But if we're looking at land areas of the sort of size which we're talking about, the size of Poland or even greater if the subsidy regime changes, then it seems unambitious only to be restoring those species which are there in the mesofauna. And it also seems that we are losing a tremendous amount of potential ecological function. And again, you go back to Ian's talk and you look at the extraordinary range of beneficial impacts that elephants have. I mean, there's recent research showing the amazing lateral diffusion of nutrients by megafauna in different parts of the world, how they transport nutrients from nutrient-rich places and they move them to nutrient-poor places, and in so doing, they're basically supporting the entire ecosystem. In the sea, incidentally, there's a vertical diffusion of nutrients where the great whales will often feed at depth, and then they will come up into the photic zone where there's enough light for photosynthesis, and they will produce fantastic outpourings of poo, enormous, what biologists politely call large fecal plumes, but I call poonamis. And these wonderful outpourings of iron-rich fertilizer, which, you know, iron's a limiting factor in many parts of the sea, which will then stimulate plankton blooms, which then stimulate the fish and the krill and the other species which the whales feed on. So the whales are actually supporting their own food sources, just as the great herbivores are on land when they move nutrients from one place to another and ensure much greater distribution of vegetation as a result. So you've got that vertical distribution by the whales, you've got that lateral distribution on land by the large herbivores. These are absolutely critical ecosystem functions, and they go beyond the ecosystem as well. If you look at the way that whales stimulate plankton growth, the plankton, of course, as we know, eventually disappears off down into the abyss, where it takes itself and everything it contains out of the biological system. Well, when whales were at the historical levels, looking at all species all the way around the world, they were probably responsible for sequestering some tens of millions of tons of carbon every year. Restoring the great whale populations could be seen as a benign form of geoengineering. At sea, it's in a way much easier to restore the megafauna than it is on land, because most of it doesn't need reintroduction. The sturgeon is an exception. But in most cases, build it and they will come. You create large no-take zones. 30% of the world's seas would be about right. And this was more or less what the World Parks Congress agreed to in 2003, and absolutely nothing's happened. That was supposed to have happened, incidentally, by 2012. That's an aim we should still be pursuing. You greatly restrict what the fishing fleet is allowed to do, and it's absolutely shocking how little we've done that. They should not be taking any megafauna. Large sharks, for instance, should be absolutely off the menu. There should be no fishing for large sharks anywhere in the world, and those techniques which accidentally catch large sharks as well, they should be either banned or highly restricted or changed. And once you've done those, once you've made those changes, then it will all come back. The whales will return, the bluefin tuna runs will return, the great white sharks will return. These species will come back. And it seems to me that we should set our sights even higher than we have done so far. That it is not enough merely to try to protect the mesofauna, which is what we've been doing in Europe so far. It's not enough, partly because we're missing out on that great sweep of ecosystem function, of all those trophic cascades and the keystone species and the diffusion of nutrients and all the other things which the megafauna do. But most importantly, we should do it because it is bloody wonderful. It is magnificent. It is why we're in this. It's what we're in this for. And we can so easily get lost. We can so easily forget why we became excited by nature in the first place. And what can be better to stimulate people to engage with nature, to fall in love once more with the natural world, to actually feel that there is a sense of hope, and an ounce of hope is worth a ton of despair, than the idea of the restoration of the European megafauna. We will know that our rewilding and wilderness ideas have succeeded when we have a Serengeti on our doorsteps. Thank you.